Great, I think we're good to go. Well, hi everybody, I'm Claire Rawlins, live in London, as you can see from the cheesy background, and I'm the Vice President of Enrollment Management at Kaplan International. I'm joined today by a lively and authoritative panel, and we're going to talk and debate a little bit about international student mobility and how we see these trends playing out over the next few years. I'm joined by, I don't know if you can see my colleagues, but I'm joined by Matt Lopez from Arizona State University, Patrick from HolonIQ, Amy from the Pi News, Rachel from the University of York in the UK, and Lucy from BridgeU, based in the UK as well. We don't know yet the full long-term impact of the pandemic on student mobility, but we're certainly already seeing some changes that are noteworthy. From students, we've seen an incredible ease and willingness to adapt to digital learning. Maybe from their parents, a little bit less enthusiasm, but students have embraced studying in the digital world in the same way they've embraced living in it. We've also seen demographics of students starting to adapt differently. China and India were always perceived as areas hostile to online study, but we're certainly seeing some emerging trends at the beginning of digital acceptance in these regions. Institutionally, we've also seen some big differences in the way institutions have managed to respond to the pandemic. And the enrollment gap between institutions has widened. The institutions who have international students has got a bigger gap between those who don't now. And I guess what's interesting is, why is that different in international student enrollment, and why has that been exacerbated through the pandemic? There's no doubt that an advanced and a nimble IT infrastructure plays a great and a significant part in that. But I think as does an international mindset, as does cultural nimbleness, and as does really the leadership of the team on the ground. But we've also seen that many people have thought they can't go it alone in this pandemic, and we're certainly seeing an increased surge in partnerships, particularly in the EdTech arena. But before I dive into any of these areas in greater detail, I'm going to throw out a question to all my friends and colleagues here with me and ask them, if they think about the next 3 years, what factors do they think will help determine whether an institution remains internationally successful or not? And maybe could you kick us off? Maybe Matt?
Yes, good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you may be from. Matt Lopez from Arizona State University. A great pleasure to be here. What interesting times, right? And I think everybody's looking for a sense of normalcy, but I think one of the things that at least we are doing at ASU is, let's not look back to getting back to normal. Our values are based on moving forward. And I think some of the greatest successes that have occurred during these incredibly challenging times is there's always been change, and in higher education and education as a whole, it's, changes are like moving tectonic plates. It takes what appears to be millennia to happen. But COVID has accelerated things that I think many educators have been hoping would have happened for many, many years. As Claire said, different geographic acceptance of digital learning, the acceptance of having technology enhanced digital learning, or even immersive learning opportunities has certainly, I think, provided lots of opportunity for certainly students, I think hopefully parents to accept. And of course, market demands will ultimately have governments and other areas be more accepting of those as well. And so as a university official, and as I'm looking at the next 3, 5, 10 years, I think some of the things that the factors that fortunately we had in play already, but but we believe will influence our success is we have to have a diversified approach. We need to have partners and collaborations and allies to move forward, continuing at a rapid pace. We need to disrupt, whether it be the way we teach, how we teach, who we teach. To me, I think those are all things. The schools that are willing to take those risks are the ones that are going to probably see return of enrollment as well. But I think the last thing that I'll say before passing it on to the other panelists is, especially in the United States, but I certainly believe that this applies globally, the pandemic has showed with a big, enormous spotlight, the disparities that we have in our economies, the disparities that we have to access to education, the disparities we even have to food and basic essentials. And in the United States right now, many of my countrymen are facing horrific cold weather across our country. And even that amongst COVID has certainly, again, highlighted other stresses among many other issues in the United States right now that have played. The universities and the educational partners that take responsibility for being a part of that problem and take full effort to solve these disparities, I believe will be the ones that will find the most success.
Thank you, Matt. I think those words about the disparities echo across the world, as we see some of those inequalities really brought out by the COVID pandemic. And it is going to be really interesting, I think, how institutions and education responds to that. Amy, can I maybe pull you in for some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, sure. And again, yeah, thanks for inviting me, and lovely to be here with you tonight. I had a little brainstorm earlier, and I came up with 5 factors of influence. So I'll try and rattle through those. I'll saying on from Matt, the first one I would say would be the online pivot. So everyone has had to move online, but I think, to echo essentially Matt's points, how universities have done that successfully will be one of the significant factors which really makes institutions stand out. Essentially, although I've been to lots of different webinars when people are talking about how well they are doing, I think we are also hearing that there are still students who are still dissatisfied or unhappy. So we have to remember that depending on your perspective, it could be glass half full or glass half empty, but there are still some students who are struggling with bandwidth or time zones. It's definitely not a problem that has been resolved entirely. So I think universities and institutions should think really carefully about the data they capture, how they use the data to be more effective, which is definitely possible. I think that's going to be one way institutions can stand out. There are education disruptors who are 100% online, doing really interesting career-based education and training. We are doing a webinar next week with Minerva, Nexford University. I think there's really real possibilities to be powerful in the way you deliver, but I think the how you do it well will be one factor of influence. Employability would be my second factor. This is absolutely crucial, and there is a lot of really great innovation around how to embed careers-based training or critical skills, resilience, teamwork. A lot of universities are really putting this front and center of their programming, and I think, again, that will be a factor which is hugely significant. And in terms of the international student recruitment, international students increasingly want to be able to either find work opportunities in that country or when they return. And I think in the UK, for example, we have post-study work rights coming on track. It's going to be really important for institutions to think carefully about how they can help students access those opportunities. Third thing is how institutions work with other institutions. And I'm actually echoing here some of the comments made at the AIEA conference in the US, which I'm sure some of you would have attended over the last few days, But a comment made by Cheryl Matherly at Lehigh, which is that partnerships are about more than mobility. Now, this is something that COVID has really brought home. It's about research, it's about joint learning, and it's about joint problem solving. So I think institutions that have really strong partnerships with global peers will also be able to enhance and learn from each other, and that will help them succeed. On a countrywide level, I'm aware I don't want to talk for too long. On a countrywide level, policy, I think in terms of a country and how it's perceived, does it have a welcoming policy immigration-wise? And in practice, what does that policy mean? So as we know, international students, many are job seeking. Canada has done so well in terms of its contributions and how it's sort of magnetism to international students, and that's because of post-study work opportunities. But I think increasingly institutions really have to think about how they help students find even part-time work and what that sort of work that they can actually deliver. We are all moving out of a pandemic. Economies are not in a great place. So I think there might be a bit of a schism between the country message in terms of policy, but then the reality of whether you can support yourself and find some part-time jobs. So I think that's something to bear in mind, and institutions need to think about that. And my last point around the factors of influence is dynamic transnational education. So this means digitally enabled, and whether you can work really creatively around how helping students access your programming. So I really believe that the concept of a 2-year master's, a 1-year master's, a 3-year degree in one country will increasingly be challenged by the concept of doing block modules, starting in one country, maybe moving to another. We've written about some really interesting models. Navitas are working with a company in India to do year 1 delivery in India. And we've written about Coventry University doing digital pathways. MSM, I know in Canada, is looking at a sort of model of year 1. And I know there's lots of institutions looking at how they can deliver digitally, but I think that sort of dynamic approach to, 4 plus 2 plus 2, 4 plus 0. I think we are already writing and hearing that a lot of that is happening, but I think that's something which will also help influence success as well. Okay, I hope that's not more than my 5 minutes, Claire.
No, and I think some of those topics you've just touched on, we're probably going to have lots of questions or a chance to talk through more, because there's certainly things that we're hearing about on the ground as well, especially that importance of employability and that desire for a more nimble study plan.
Actually, I know in Kaplan, you've been doing that for a long time, haven't you? In Singapore, for example, offering a chance to start somewhere and end somewhere. But I really do think that's going to be a growing trend.
But I think until now, it's been something probably people have wanted, but not that many people have actually done. And like you say, this might be the start of people really doing those multi-destination studies. But Patrick, we know that HolonIQ studies these things in an incredible amount of depth. So can we pass over to you?
Thanks, Claire. Such wonderful kind of concepts already to reflect on. But I think, and I love your question as well. I mentioned that to you before in terms of factors of influence. What I also like actually about is the qualifier you gave us of kind of 3 years, because 3 years kind of goes really fast actually from a planning perspective. Although reflecting on the last year, it's crazy what we all did in the space of didn't do in the space of 12 months. But I think mindset actually, or the institution's whole approach to this is a massive factor of influence, even in a 3-year period. It's, student mobility, I've no doubt it will return. To what level, it's anyone's guess at the moment. But I kind of encourage all of our kind of university customers to actually step out of their institution and look back at all of the options, at the whole landscape. So for the frame of reference, not to be just internally and degrees and 1+1 or online or whatever, there is just a massive spectrum of options that has developed and matured through this period. And we in international education, we talk a lot about destinations taking share and the like. But in the digital spectrum, you're kind of competing with everyone everywhere. It's not just are we going to get our share of the inbound to the US market or the UK market, or Canada's gaining share? digital just changes the game completely. Absolutely, from an augmentation or supplementation or on ramps or off ramps, and even from virtual internships, we've seen an enormous amount of growth in spaces such as that. You know, Amy brought up partnerships, and we've seen just an explosion in partnerships. I think the fastest way for an institution to respond who perhaps hasn't had the benefit of an internationalization strategy is a partnership. You know, to find someone who just does this for a living and does this for a whole bunch of folks, and to bring them together. I think we're thinking differently about parents as well. Parents have just gained so much power and interest and you know, knowledge through this process, and are such a bigger stakeholder than they may have been before in the market as well. And even just reframing, when we look back at institutions, the whole concept of a credential, of a degree. You know, a lot of the innovation that we're seeing is unbundling, is blocks and sharing blocks across geographies or institutions and the like as well. And, you know, we've seen a lot of innovation from folks who are just rethinking international ed in that frame of reference as well. And some incredible innovation, much of it, yes, coming out of markets like China and India, they're not waiting for destinations to innovate. Those markets are really taking the lead in that respect as well. So yeah, I think what will define, you know, thrive or survive for institutions in the next 3 years, as corny as it might sound, in the first instance will be their whole mindset and about how they tackle this. And if it's not a mindset that's global, if it's not a mindset that's not thinking really differently about how to do things, and a mindset that is perhaps trapped back in, you know, this too shall pass, or, you know, I can't wait till it gets back to normal. I think I worry about institutions who are really adopting that mindset versus one of, you know, I mean, Matt and ASU, such a, you know, fabulous kind of place to start is, you know, this is the new normal. Get over it and get on with it. move ahead.
Thank you, Patrick. We've just had a request if people could reintroduce themselves just before they start talking. So Rachel, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and hi everyone, it's great to be here. I'm Rachel McSween. I'm the Director of International Recruitment, Partnerships and Mobility at the University of York in the UK, not York University in Canada, who I know are on the call, so University of York. And I started here in March last year, so just about 3 weeks before the pandemic struck, and we went into lockdown. So it's been a very interesting time, but as Patrick said, the question that we were posed, our exam question, is really interesting, and I'm going to touch on a few things that have actually come up already. Claire, you mentioned that in your introduction. Patrick, you focused on this as well. My first influencing factor is definitely mindset. And I'll start with a negative and work my way up to being more positive. But I think it'd be really damaging to the possibilities within internationalization to return to a mindset of kind of core rigidity. So what I mean is, you know, we moved to online learning because we had to, not because we wanted to, nor did we necessarily feel ready, or that was going to be what our kind of product would be as universities. And I don't even really mean a return to core rigidity within just classroom delivery. What I mean more is, as Patrick pointed out, that kind of notion that we cannot wholesale change the way we do things. We deliver things in certain ways, we perform in certain ways. We know that's not true anymore. We've had to pivot. We've had to change the way we've done things. And I think it'd be really disappointing. And I wonder, I have this, you know, what could we do if our business depended on it? What is the art of the possible if the business depended on us behaving differently, acting differently? I don't want the sector to breathe a sigh of relief collectively and say, well, you know, thank goodness we've got through that, and return to that rigidity of process or thought. The second factor is actually accountability, and specifically accountability around sustainability. That's a bit of a mouthful, but something I think we can take forward is meaningful and lasting sustainability agendas. So I think we're going to have to look a lot more closely and carefully at our carbon footprint as institutions. We've hung dear, and I'm part of this gang, I've kind of hung dear to the concept that we have to travel to be successful. in internationalisation as staff, let alone the students that we attract to our institutions. And I know it won't be the same for everybody on the call, and success is a loose term here, but we have had our most successful recruitment year ever at the University of York, and none of the campus-based staff have been on a plane since February 2020. So although we do have a network of in-country staff that are doing a lot of the work for us, we, should we actually cut down further on the carbon and the sustainability to support the sustainability agenda? I'm keen that we move away from the idea that we are personally rewarded for frequent flying to that idea that we are kind of collectively rewarded for a mindset of infrequent flying. And I think it's really important when you look at Gen Z coming through, they are really attached to the SDGs. They're attached to kind of what their role can be in a global challenge. And I think if we want to stand by those values with them, we really have to think about sustainability in a much broader sense. And some of the things we used to do, jump on the plane to the Middle East for a weekend to do an exhibition, or fly to Australia for a conference, we really have to think carefully about that sort of stuff if we're going to have, and I think that can have a lasting impact. Because actually, my third point is around technology, and this has been raised by a couple of people. And I think another road to success within internationalization is to embrace AI and machine learning to enhance relationships, but also to enhance processes. And I suppose when I'm thinking about it at the moment, for personal reasons, within my workload, I'm thinking about how we enhance processes around attracting students, conversion and admissions. I think there are cultural issues at universities around people not really truly feeling empowered to embrace technology and not really feeling that they can have an influence in putting tech into their organizations. But even if they do realize they want it, there's not a lot of experience in buying it, implementing it, and kind of constantly improving that technology. And people might say, why bother? Why bother with technology? Is it that important to us? We have people and processes. I think we hang dear to people and processes, but I do think we miss the role that technology can play within that. And I think there are things that people do very well, and there are things that technology do very well. And I think we have to have a lot more of an open conversation about how we separate those two things out and complement it with technology. Tech does admin automation very, very well. Humans don't. It's often boring, it's repetitive, it's prone to error. We need to embrace the technology, the ed tech space as well, for what we can do within particularly admissions and recruitment. I think about the word I keep thinking coming back to is kind of curiosity. Like, we need more curiosity around technological improvements within higher education, and put ourselves in the shoes of applicants or partners who are used to incredibly slick technology and everything they're doing in their day-to-day life. Uber, Netflix, Spotify, Instagram, everything that they're using is slick and constantly improving. Why should we not find ourselves in that space as well, that they have a slick engagement process when they're interacting with us, whether it's as an applicant or a partner in that onboarding space? And I know that the PI have got a conference on tech and TNE actually in March. It'd be really, really interesting to see what kind of things are being discussed at that conference, because I think it's a space we all need to kind of make that leap of faith into. Thanks, Claire.
No, thank you, Rachel. I think, there are so many things to follow up on there, but I will pass over to Lucy before we dive any deeper into these.
Thanks so much, Claire, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just sort of overwhelmed with comments that were made by my panelists, and I'm going to try and not sort of duplicate key points, but maybe try and reinforce a few of those. By way of introduction, my name is Lucy Stonehill. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called BridgeU. We're the market-leading provider of university and careers guidance software and services into international schools. We work with schools, high schools that is, in 120 countries, and we work with higher education partners, including, very gratefully ASU and York, and helping them really engage that community and that audience as a distinctive channel. And naturally, we deliver all of that service online. So last year was a pretty exciting one for us. I think one of the things that I just wanted to comment on, and I think a couple of my peers and colleagues have mentioned this, but one of the things, of course, is that the shock waves of impact for students from 2020, I think we're only just starting to understand how they have now, as a collective perhaps, started to rethink or think differently about their choices. We're certainly seeing this in our students. We kind of monitor different cohorts, and so we can compare sort of patterns of usage and engagement across the different year, and that makes for a pretty interesting kind of year-on-year sort of comparison or analysis. And one of the things that we're seeing, which I think is an opportunity, but it's a challenge, is that students who sort of went through 2020, who at least were in the sort of penultimate years of high school study in our case, those students sort of encountered a world of much greater choice, in fact, than perhaps what some of their predecessors encountered. And I mean choice in a couple of key ways that references some of the key themes that people have talked about. Firstly, online delivery. You know, they had no choice but to experience the sort of online delivery. And so that now feels more familiar to these students who are considering post-secondary transitions. So I echo what Amy said. I think there's a huge opportunity, very much nascent perhaps in the undergrad space, but very much existing for dynamic transnational experiences in education. The other thing, which we haven't spoken that much about, is that we've certainly seen students continue to kind of hold strong to the traditionally very popular host destinations like the US and the UK, but we've also seen students apply to a broader range of study destinations. And we start to sort of think in our world that some of those could become very compelling challenger destinations, or perhaps it's not the destination itself, but it is a specific university that's really innovating on and hoping to attract, you know, the same fantastic global student talent that the likes of UK, US, and Australian universities have been seeing in sort of droves before. So we definitely see from that perspective, I think for students, it's suddenly not necessarily considering only on-campus options because they've had exposure to online delivery, nor are they necessarily considering the same set of host destinations. And I think, again, from a student's perspective, choice is good, it's empowering, but it also means more complexity for these students. And that's certainly where I think there's a greater opportunity overall to kind of educate and guide and help students understand how they can maneuver their way through what is going to be a more complex decision-making process. So I guess I first wanted to just sort of reference what we're seeing as it relates to the student sort of cohorts that we support. I completely echo some of my colleagues in saying that, you know, to me, the institutions that we work with who are investing very heavily in developing a kind of impactful digital recruitment platform, and that is, Rachel, as you so eloquently put, an integration of people, process evolution, and technology to support as and when it can. I think those organizations will fare very well in the coming years. I think there's an opportunity also not to simply slip into what I'm thinking of as a sort of halfway house of innovation, just slap a Zoom label on top of a 3-day, 4-day virtual event and assume that a bunch of 17-year-olds will dial in for, you know, 4, 5, 6 hours a day. That's how it used to happen. And simply throwing a kind of very light technology layer on that does not necessarily mean it will be a successful event or encounter. So I think there's an opportunity to deconstruct the old ways of working and to really reinterrogate whether those old ways should actually be thrown out sort of altogether. And I guess my final point there, I think there is exciting opportunities to reconstruct new ways of working, as you were saying, Rachel, or new models, new partnerships that actually aim to fundamentally meet students where they are on their terms. And that may have, you know, something in common with how things were. It may have very little in common with how things were. And then the final thing I wanted to say as well, you know, I think there's certainly sort of a language or a vernacular I hear amongst higher ed with sort of, you know, not necessarily bemoaning the fact that this change is here and it's happening so quickly, but I think we also need to acknowledge who the winners are coming out of what happened last year. And certainly I'll just give one anecdotal example. We work with high schools all over the world, and we help universities directly engage with those high schools through a series of different mechanisms. But one of the key things that we felt a real need to help replace was the traditional sort of school and university visit. And so we have a virtual method through which to do that. And we helped our university partners discover high schools and book visits with them in 92 countries. The most engaged continent, the most engaged audience of students and counselors were our high schools and our students and counselors in Africa. We work with high schools in 23 countries who frankly had not been on the flight path before. They hadn't had the opportunity to have dynamic, fantastic interactions with the likes of, York and ASU. So actually there's a lot of students or communities of students perhaps who've been neglected in the prior ways of working. And I think it's important for us as we go forward not to forget that there are lots of students who've kind of gained or who are benefiting from the evolution of how universities and students are expected to interact going forward.
Sorry. We've got a question, Lucy, for you from Karen. Could you talk a little bit more about the challenger destinations that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. I could talk about this for way more than the 3 to 5 minutes. But so what I really mean by challenger destinations are perhaps destinations that are not traditionally popular, top 4, top 5 host destinations for students, but who have made a massive concerted effort to participate in the flow of globally mobile students. A really good example is the Netherlands. I mean, there's just an extraordinary number of courses taught in English. There's a very concerted effort to treat students who are not from the Netherlands as a priority audience to engage. And I think there's to your point earlier on, Amy, there's a real kind of policy to support that at the government level. We also are seeing this in an institution we work with is a fantastic institution called Stockholm School of Economics, and prior to a couple of years ago they didn't have bachelor degrees in English, where they were very much focused on trying to attract and draw a global student base to those programs, but they're a very renowned institution within Sweden. And so for them, they're seeing this as an opportunity to say, hey, we want to participate. We're a fantastic, fantastically well-known institution within Sweden. We're going to adapt and evolve and deliver programs, in person, online, as the case may be, to really engage a different segment or a broader audience of prospective international students. So I think for me, there's challenger destinations, but then there's challenger institutions who may not necessarily be within challenger destinations, but they are certainly making a very concerted effort to participate in the flow of students that we're all discussing here.
Thank you, Lucy. And a quick question for you, Rachel. Basically from Gary, why has York had its best year, apart from the fact you joined?
Well, I mean, that's obviously just coincidence. Actually, it's a really good question. It's one we've been doing quite a lot of soul searching on, but I think students that we were recruiting, and I think I've seen the question there asking if it's undergraduate or postgraduate. We've been more successful in both those categories, but we are weighted towards postgraduate recruitment for international students. I think a lot of our students were quite far down their decision-making journey by the time the pandemic really took hold in sort of April, May time in the UK. And when we polled our students around whether they were going to come and start in September, whether they were going to come and start later in the year, there was just a sense of, well, we're already on a sabbatical from our work, or we've already left our jobs, or we've told them we're leaving. So we do really want to commit to the study plans we've made. I mean, of course, I'm biased towards how York have reacted to the pandemic, but they have put the student at the centre of a lot of the decision-making process, as they should have done. So we were very understanding about partial completion of undergraduate degrees and how we were using transcripts to make decisions on entry to master's programmes. We were flexible on English language tests for the first time in a long time. We started working with Duolingo and other providers to say, actually, students can't get to the IELTS test centre the way they used to, so we'll take other English language qualifications. We implemented a near miss policy for students. If they had come close to what the condition was, we were relaxed about that as well, because we understood that their undergraduate study had been disrupted. We also put on a second intake in January, and believe me when I say that's one of the most challenging things we've done. It sounds like a small thing to do, but when you are then teaching master's degrees twice, because we let the students start in September, and then for maybe our top 12 master's programs, we ran them again for a second intake. And we had hoped to get about 500 students. We got about 750. And we think a lot of that was to do with by the time those students were enrolling, we actually had quite a lot of goodwill and good PR in the market because of the enhancements we put around student arrivals. We were offering free quarantine. We were offering kind of food boxes were being delivered. We put Christmas hampers in people's rooms if they had to isolate on campus over Christmas. So the approach the university took, and the approach that the Vice-Chancellor took to us as staff as well, was do what you can when you can and be kind to yourselves and others. And that kind of just then cascaded into all the practice that we were putting in place for student recruitment as well. So I think it was a combination of students being really prepared and still wanting to stick to their plans, but also us being really nice to the students about it as well, and just making sure that they understood that although they maybe didn't get the criteria that they hoped for, they could still come and have that conversation with us, and we'd be welcoming of them. So a combination of empathy and I think student dedication. And we've been blown away by the students, actually. They've been so committed to their study, even the ones that are not yet on campus because they started online and they're still online due to travel restrictions. So with yeah, really hugely impressive.
Thank you, Rachel. We've certainly had some fantastic feedback from our students who are at York over this period. I wanted to really jump and follow up on something you said earlier, Rachel, which is what happens when all this is over, if it's all over? And I think we all sort of grapple a bit with this, both personally and professionally. How quickly will we just slip back into our own ways? Or how has the world really changed? You know, will we continue to challenge ourselves to say, right, like, what could we do in the next year if we really had to or wanted to? Or will people sort of sigh a bit of a relief that some of the pressure's off and we can slip back into those old habits that in some cases we've had for hundreds of years? So I wanted to ask everybody here, we're seeing all these things, we're hearing about all these trends. If you had to pick one or two things that have come out of this period that you think is really here to stay, and I'm sure some of you might have three, and that's okay too, what would you really focus in on? And maybe back to you, Matt.
So to kind of help my panelists, I'm going to go a little outside of the box here. You know, and ASU is a little unique in the sense that as a public, public enterprise, we take a great responsibility, not only as an educator, but also in the impact that we make on our community. So I really appreciate Rachel's sustainability comments. You know, I think something that, and this was a trend even before COVID, but again, COVID helped to accelerate, is how do we recreate education through exploration, right? How do we utilize these high intensity technology-based learning experiences that start in the nurseries and continue to post grad and beyond, right? Is how do we create these opportunities for people to continuously learn, but do so in a manner that is infinitely scalable, that is even more importantly personalized to their needs, interests, and wants, by utilizing kind of adaptive learning solutions and things. And so, I mean, our president, if you're aware of Michael Crow, certainly thinks a lot differently than most. And I love seeing the comments of the people that don't believe him, but everything he said has come true. And you know, we really want to make education personal. Who's to say that the way you have to do this degree is the right way of doing it, right? And so we've really kind of looked at it. I wish I had some of the flexibility Rachel mentioned in regards to changing up a little bit of our requirements and some of those things. And certainly we looked at English proficiency differences. But from the core of what a student looks at, from outcomes and the careers that Amy mentioned before, can we customize lengthy programs? You know, who's to say that coming to the United States for a 4-year bachelor's degree is going to last very long? What if you could do, we've mentioned 1 year in Tokyo, 1 year in the United States, 2 years at home? Or what if you did your first year in the United States and then the last 3 years at home? I mean, there are all sorts of ways that, again, we're personalizing the educational process based on opportunity that meets the needs of people. And so I veered a little bit from my education through exploration, but I think that's the whole hope, is we're learners from youth, and let's continue to provide learning opportunities, even if it means they can only come to the United States or Australia or the UK for a short amount of time. I don't think anybody can expect to disrupt people's lives anymore and expect them to move for a long length of time, unless there are economic reasons that have driven most of our mobility in the past. So anyway, I will pass the torch back to Amy.
Shall I just go straight on from there? Great, because I'm going to totally piggyback on what you just said, Matt. Sorry, Claire, do you want to reintroduce me? No. Okay, you came up. I mean, this is not one I'd written down, but this is one I totally think is an important one, and it is following on from what Matt said. I think one of the lasting trends we will see is an increasingly granular understanding of the profile, the various profiles of student and what they want. And I saw a question came up in the chat about what about the students and the social experience is an important part of the university experience. Now, when my children go to university, I imagine they will be seeking that important sort of experience of living abroad or living, away in another city, hopefully abroad, with a cohort of peers. But I put that very question to the founder of Nexford University, who I'm interviewing next week, which is an entirely 100% online university. And I said, what about students missing that interaction, the sort of cultural immersion? And he said, and he sort of looked at me and he was like, well, a lot of our students are in sub-Saharan Africa and that's not what they want. They want a job. And I think exactly what Matt said, it's an increasingly granular understanding of some people want that, I'm going to move to Oxford and I'm going to have a great time. And some people want to work while they're doing a part-time job and looking after their children, and they just want to have a better chance of getting a career. So I think a much more sort of granular approach to who the student is and what their needs are, as Matt said. Another lasting trend, I think, which is what Lucy alluded to, is the use of technology in everything, but definitely student recruitment. So that's something I've been really interested in. We've seen the rise of ApplyBoard, Adventus. We've seen Bridge U suddenly emerge as this, very useful platform, but technology-backed platforms, the other thing which we've written about quite a lot, but the investment, like the amount, and Patrick will know all about this, but the amount of investment into ed tech to try and solve problems, which is either student recruitment or student engagement, huge, phenomenal. I mean, some of the biggest investments we've seen in the last decade, in the last few years, I'd say, and Patrick, you might want to talk more about that, but I think investment in ed tech and technology to help solve problems. And then, my third lasting trend is just this focus on career outcomes and how universities can do something innovative around that too.
Thank you, Amy. And Patrick, the research HolonIQ has been doing in this area are absolutely fascinating. So can you maybe piggyback on some of Amy and Matt's comments?
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Amy. Look, I've got three that are perhaps a bit unpopular, but they're definitely in the thematic of embrace now and make changes for now. Create upside for your institution if it ever looks anything like it used to. But my three are like tuition deflation is here to stay and may continue. The price of higher ed is going down. It's just a question of how much, whether it's a little or a whole lot. Government funding is not going to return to normal. It will continue to slide. Governments are stimulating their economies at levels never before. Government has never had this low ability to fund higher education the way it has historically. And on the flip side, there has never been more private capital looking to support innovative solutions in education. It is staggering how much capital there is in the private market, aside from the public market, where governments are just not going to fund education to the level that they are. Micro-credentials and the unbundling of the degree is absolutely here to stay. And there's, again, the question is how, to what extent it will unbundle. The degree will be sacred forever. There's no doubt about it, but it's fascinating what we've seen through the pandemic. The unbundling that is happening is very, very significant. And the employer as a stakeholder, I mean, that is just absolutely taking off as well. And then finally, we've said this over and over again, but you can see it in the comments, is like digital. Digital is here to stay. I mean, if your institution is not thinking digital first, and that's not as a strapline for some strategic plan to make people on the board happy, but a genuine commitment to how could we make digital first and the face-to-face piece, the real cream value add on top, as a way of doing business. And I genuinely think, I'm not trying to promote digital or any of those things. I genuinely analytically believe those trends have seen breadcrumbs about them in 2020. And I've stopped thinking of them as things that we should fear and thinking of things that we should internalize and make decisions on. They're my big three.
And Patrick, when you think about sort of micro credentials and other qualifications, do you think these are going to be things that play more and more into the employability that we're hearing from Amy, is so pivotal in student decision making as well?
The fastest growing segment in micro credentials is employer purchased, where employers through the pandemic were thinking, how do we support all of our staff that are everywhere? And how do we just give them the tools that they need to do their job? And they weren't about to enroll their 80,000 staff around the world in a master's course. They were thinking, how can I get them just a little snippet in product management, a little snippet in customer success, or a commitment to a certificate perhaps, so that maybe they've got some optionality for later in data science. And what a wonderful opportunity when you're trapped at home to learn a whole new skill as a learner. And so that employer sponsored piece, whereas before we were thinking, especially with the likes of, say, InStride, where ASU is a big part of that, we were thinking, okay, employers and education as a benefit. I mean, I've no doubt that will continue, but the micro-credentialing piece is huge, and employers are a massive stakeholder in that.
Thank you. I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot on that in your conference coming up, Amy, on micro-credentials and how they fit in.
Yeah.
But Lucy, if you're thinking about what's going to come out of this period, what's on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo a lot of what's already been said. I think there was just a couple of sort of pieces that I felt I might sort of add to the reflections or the forecast. Absolutely. I mean, I'm biased. I run a digital data business that operates in global education, right? So I certainly have a certain vantage point and perspective on these things. I think, digital engagement, as we've said, as Patrick has said, has to be a digital first perspective, has to be how we treat and we train admissions and enrollment teams and recruitment teams to think. And I completely echo, I think, Rachel's points earlier, that there are challenges with that. There's a change management challenge underway that we have to be delicate about solving and supporting. I think, on the other side of things, as a partner trying to work with higher ed, and also working now, of course, with K-12 in 120 countries, I think the thing that is very important and feels very much lasting for me is the idea that we still don't know the mechanics of these new models and what's going to work for students in certain markets at different grade level, at different levels. And so, as a sort of partner into higher ed, one of the things that I think is really important is that we are genuinely working in partnership, because I think Matt sort of talked about how those institutions who continue to sort of innovate and evolve and test and learn and iterate, making mistakes along the way, will be the higher ed institutions that come out really strong. The same is true as a provider of services digitally to education. We are just trying to stay 2-3. I'd be thrilled if we just stayed 2 steps ahead of where the market's going, because I think from that perspective, you're always trying to kind of learn and innovate and reflect the needs as they are changing and evolving. So I think it's critically important for higher education partners to think of their partners, those that are sort of maybe helping them or arming them with digital capability, as genuine partners, and be brave enough to recognize that you may not get it right at the outset, but there's a spirit of innovation and a willingness to kind of test and iterate and learn. So I think to me that's quite important in this environment where there's a lot of potential room for fantastic new ways of operating, but there's going to be a period of learning to kind of get to that endpoint. I guess the second thing, and it sounds related, but it's not intended to be related, but I think a lot of my exposure to higher ed has been institutions that have built these amazingly kind of complicated 3, 5, 10-year plans, leveraging mostly historical data and an understanding about how they've operated in the past. And I think that's going to become a real challenge, because 2020 has certainly thrown things off the radar, not to mention all the trends and sort of disruptions and innovations we've discussed in this call. So for me, I think one of the key capabilities of higher ed is going to be sort of building that data or analytics capabilities so that decisions can start to be made from a place of knowledge or awareness about the future, not necessarily having to exclusively rely upon the past. And you look, I say that knowing that that's a hard thing to do, right? Patrick has built an amazing business that's fundamentally a data and intelligence platform and company operation. That's not an easy thing to do, but I certainly think there's enough really brilliant people in higher education, in admissions offices, in international offices that I think there could be some real wins in working across the sector to figure out how we can leverage data to make more informed decisions, whether that's a decision about budget allocation or a decision about admission of students who are going to be successful at your institution.
Rachel, conscious of time, so
I know I'll be very quick. I speak fast anyway. It's part of the DNA. One I had, Claire, but I won't dwell on it, is customer service, and I think it's been a wake-up call to us. I don't think it's a trend. It shouldn't be looked at as a trend, but it's given us a wake-up call as to just how reliant we are on our international connections, whether that's for recruitment or partnerships. So customer service, and that being front of mind, is something we take with us. I think for us as well at York, we've been looking at how we facilitate more virtual international experiences for students. So although some of the comments in the chat are really intriguing around, how do you replicate that student experience if they can't actually go to campus? We have it the other way around, where a lot of our students choose the University of York because of the ability to go and study abroad for a semester or a year. But obviously we've had to move into a virtual experiences space, but it also really chimes well with our agenda to widen participation. So there's plenty of students, money aside, that cannot travel for an international experience because of health or caring responsibilities, or they work part-time and they study part-time. So I love the fact we've been able to open up our experiences to include those groups who would never normally get that opportunity just because they've all been virtual. And I think that is fairer access for more people, which I'm really passionate about. And the last thing would be, I think it's changed the way we have been able to onboard some partners. So University of York is brand new in the T&E and partnership space. That's part of my responsibility, but we did launch a new partnership in December with an institution in Greece, and it's our Europe campus, which is really exciting. But in the before times, we would have kind of flown the VC, probably the deans, probably the international lead to Greece, would have had a very lovely event with them, and then we would have flown them home and then hosted the same group from them back to us. But what we were able to do instead of was have a virtual away day with about 50 people from each side contributing to these breakout rooms. And just that synergy that we were able to achieve really early on by lots of people across the institution, because of the way we were able to kind of do that event because it was on Zoom, meant that actually there was a much bigger ripple effect, a much bigger buzz about that partnership very early on, rather than it be something that's signed at the top and then eventually it makes its way down. It was able to kind of come into our DNA very quickly. So it's really opened our eyes as to what future partnership onboarding might look like, and just about complementary ways to bring partnerships to life. And it was one of the best things we did last year. So again, it's just, you think you can do it one way, but you need to think about how you can do it other ways, in embracing that digital space.
Thank you, Rachel. I know I've certainly been quite obsessed and fascinated by how that student support and customer service has evolved, but become even more important in the pandemic. There's something about being remote that makes something that is auto-generated, impersonal, a bit cold feel even colder, isn't it? And I think we've certainly felt that the people, the institutions, the companies that show some warmth really have grown through that. We've got only 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kill two birds with one stone with this question. Patrick, can you please reintroduce yourself and your company? And whilst doing that, then, we all seem to think, I think everyone here thinks micro credentials, smaller courses, stackable courses are here to stay. But a couple of questions merging together about really, how does that work? What does it mean? I'm not sure if you could, maybe Patrick, Amy, give us a quick snapshot of your thoughts of that.
So Patrick Brothers, co-CEO of HolonIQ, Global Impact Intelligence. We work with universities, really large technology companies, investors, governments around the world to help them make better decisions, basically. We just did a piece. It's actually on our website right now. We're about to send it out to our 30,000 newsletter really, really shortly. And we just did a piece to size micro-credentials, to segment micro-credentials, and to look at 4 scenarios for the future of micro-credentials within the context of a degree. And I think that it's fair to say there is no standard right now. We all are meaning different things when we say the same words. I think the European qualification framework is probably leading the charge at making sense of this space. But I mean, there's so much that could happen, and hence why we looked at this from a scenario perspective. But I'm convinced, just looking at government policy around the world, at consumer sentiment around the world, and at the financial challenges and the dynamics of digital, that institutions who really embrace the concept of unbundling degrees, as horrible as that may sound or feel for some, will actually be a really key determinant of success in the next 10 or 20 years. The shape of higher education, I think, will change fundamentally. Degrees will stay, absolutely. I hope my kids aspire to go to university and get a fabulous qualification and learn a bucket load in the process. But I think the reality of where we see the employers heading and the market will be different.
Thank you.
Would you like me to come in too?
Yeah, you can have exactly 90 seconds.
Okay. I mean, just briefly on this, what we see a lot of is companies coming out which are offering something in addition to the degree. So often it's a proven experience in a workplace, being mentored by an employer. And I'm actually briefing a journalist earlier, and I wrote down lots of the companies I want him to investigate. But for example, we have Practera, Room, Fourth Rev, Ripen, Paragon One, Grad Loop. I mean, these are all companies who are essentially offering something as well as a degree, but you can show your degree, and then you can say, I spent 3 months working as an intern at Facebook, for example. That's where we see all the innovation. And it's something which is great for institutions, because you can grab hold of this and work with this. A lot of these platforms require, it's like a trio effect. They require the employer, the student, and the institution, because they want the university to help endorse their program, which they have the employers on board for already. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and watch this space, because we'll be writing a lot more about it. One more thing really quickly, I just see in the chat, people were asking about starting in one country and moving to another, and what if they don't get the visa? I just thought I'd share with you, I just quickly found a story on our site. This is what University of Auckland is doing in China, just to give you an example. They said they do what they call 3+1+X. The student starts for 3 years in China, they can finish there and get the Chinese degree, but they can come in year 4 and get a degree here and go on to a master's here. So I think obviously some universities can do a sort of piecemeal approach, so you don't have to travel abroad if you don't need to, or if you can't get the visa.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you to everybody. I can't believe we've got through an hour, and I'm afraid we haven't managed to answer everybody's questions. So we will follow up with you all. I mean, impossible to sum up in just a few seconds some of the thoughts and feelings that have ran through this discussion. But I think everybody seems to agree that change is here to stay. That things, the way we study, how we partner, and what we do is not going to go back to the way it was 2 or 3 years ago. And the institutions and the companies that really thrive over the next few years are going to be those that run with that and embrace that. So it's going to be fascinating to see where that takes us. Massive thank you to our panelists for joining us, and to everybody from around the world who's here. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.